Now on to our fourth and final historical litmus test, succession. Is Rome's Petrine role portrayed as an enduring office carried forward through succession? First up, we will actually be taking another look at St. Cyprian. The section we just read for the third litmus test works for the fourth litmus test as well. After all, quote, there is easy proof for faith in a short summary of the truth. The Lord speaks to Peter, saying, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Logically, if this Peter is to be the defender of orthodoxy, the rock upon which Christ builds his church, then his foundational role must exist so long as the church does. St. Cyprian treats it as a given that when in doubt, one could look to Rome as to the answer, which is impossible if Peter had no successors with his authority or charism. But so as not to reuse material, let's look at his 51st epistle titled To Antonianus about Cornelius and Novatian. Sections 8 and 9 are our primary focus. For the sake of time, I will summarize the first part of section 8. Cyprian explains that Cornelius' legitimacy as Bishop of Rome should be judged not by the accusations of his opponents, but by the providence of God and the unanimous testimony of the wider episcopate. He stresses that Cornelius did not rise suddenly or ambitiously to the episcopacy, but advanced gradually through the established ecclesiastical offices, proving his worth through faithful service. Far from seeking power, Cyprian portrays him as humble and reluctant, ultimately accepting the office only under pressure from others. His election, Cyprian adds, was carried out in Rome with the participation and approval of numerous bishops, whose letters attested to both the validity of his ordination and the integrity of his character. Then we read, quote, Moreover, Cornelius was made bishop by the judgment of God and of his Christ, by the testimony of almost all the clergy, by the suffering of the people who were then present, and by the assembly of ancient priests and good men, when no one had been made so before him, when the place of Fabian, that is, when the place of Peter in the degree of his sacerdotal throne was vacant, which being occupied by the will of God and established by the consent of all of us, whosoever now wishes to become a bishop must needs be made from without, and he cannot have the ordination of the church who does not hold the unity of the church. Whoever he may be, although greatly boasting about himself and claiming very much for himself, he is profane, he is an alien, he is without. And as after the first there cannot be a second, whosoever is made after one who ought to be alone is not second to him, but is in fact none at all. Then in section 9, Cyprian goes on to praise Cornelius' conduct after his election, emphasizing that he accepted the episcopate as an act of divine vocation rather than personal ambition. He highlights Cornelius' courage and steadfast faith in continuing to occupy the Roman episcopal seat during a time of intense imperial hostility, when the very presence of a Christian bishop in Rome provoked the threat of severe persecution. By remaining firm under these dangers, Cornelius is presented as embodying the virtues of a confessor, demonstrating spiritual strength and pastoral resolve. Cyprian's point being that Cornelius' endurance in office, even under the shadow of martyrdom, confirms both the legitimacy of his episcopal role and the seriousness of the charge entrusted to him. Now, I'd like to call your attention to this key line. Quote, when the place of Fabian, that is, when the place of Peter in the degree of the sacerdotal throne was vacant. Notice that St. Cyprian does not merely say Peter once had primacy, but rather he says Cornelius now occupies, quote, the place of Peter. Also, note that he says, quote, the sacerdotal throne was vacant. If Peter's role or position was specific to his lifetime, then his place couldn't be described as vacant when a successor of his passes away. In other words, one cannot have a vacant Petrine place unless Peter's role is understood as continuing beyond his lifetime. And notice what he says at the end, quote, as after the first there cannot be a second. Whosoever is made after one who ought to be alone is not second to him, but is in fact none at all. St. Cyprian is arguing that there is one legitimate successor to Peter. There cannot be multiple competing claimants since the office itself is unitary. If Fabian used to occupy Peter's place, which was a single defined ecclesial position which is structural and transferable upon its vacancy to Cornelius, then this passage undeniably leans in favor of a positive verdict for our fourth litmus test. In the ancient world, a chair or cathedra was a technical legal term for an office of magisterial authority. By describing the Roman see as Peter's place and noting it was vacant, the early church was acknowledging that this wasn't just about Peter the man, it was about the Petrine office. A personal privilege dies with the man who holds it, but an office survives him. An office is an objective reality that continues to exist even when the man occupying it dies. Just as the Oval Office exists regardless of who is president, the chair of Peter remained a functional reality that required a new occupant to preserve the structural integrity of the church. Next up, we are once again going to take a look at St. Irenaeus' work Against Heresies, written in approximately 200 AD. Our primary focus will be Book 3, Chapter 3, Section 3. For our third litmus test, we examined Sections 1 and 2. For the fourth litmus test, we'll be looking at Section 3, which directly follows his train of thought. So as a very brief refresher, Irenaeus' basic arguments in Sections 1 and 2 is that orthodoxy is verified not by private interpretation or secret tradition, but by public apostolic succession in historic churches. Since the apostles deposited the faith in the church and that faith continues through the bishops, heretical groups are disqualified precisely because they cannot trace themselves back to the apostles. And although many churches could make this case, Irenaeus says Rome is sufficient as the clearest test case because of its exceptional apostolic standing and authority. Now we come to section 3. Quote, "The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him in the third place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. This man, as he had seen the blessed apostles and had been conversant with them, might be said to have the preaching of the apostles still echoing in his ears, and their traditions before his eyes. Nor was he alone in this, for there were many still remaining who had received instruction from the apostles. In the time of this Clement, no small dissension having occurred among the brethren at Corinth, the church in Rome dispatched a most powerful letter to the Corinthians, exhorting them to peace, renewing their faith, and declaring the tradition which it had lately received from the apostles, proclaiming the one God, omnipotent, the maker of heaven and earth, the creator of man, who brought on the deluge and called Abraham, who led the people from the land of Egypt, spake with Moses, set forth the law, sent the prophets, and who has prepared fire for the devil and his angels. From this document, whosoever chooses to do so may learn that he, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, was preached by the churches, and may also understand the apostolic tradition of the church, since this epistle is of older date than these men who are now propagating falsehood, and who conjure into existence another God beyond the creator and maker of all existing things. To this Clement there succeeded Evaristus. Alexander followed Evaristus, then 6 from the apostles. Sixtus was appointed after him. Telephorus, who was gloriously martyred, and Hyginus after him. Pius then after him. Anicetus. Soter, having succeeded Anicetus. Eleutherius does now, in the 12th place from the apostles, hold the inheritance of the episcopate. In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth have come down to us. And this is the most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth." Remember in section 2 where he said, quote, "The very great, the very ancient, and universally known church founded and organized at Rome by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul." In the very first line in this section we read, quote, "The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate." So Peter and Paul did not merely found the church at Rome, but they handed on the office, singular, to Linus, singular, and then throughout the rest of the section he enumerates the rest of the successors to his current day. This further confirms that the apostolic role in Rome is not treated as ending with the apostles' death, but rather it is formally entrusted onward in an episcopal office. It is also important to note that he doesn't use vague terms when speaking of these successors. He gives us a concrete line of bishops, and all of this is in the context of his argument against the heretics that the litmus test for orthodoxy is whether your leaders can trace themselves back to the apostles. Notice the key line toward the end of the section. Quote, "Eleutherius does now in the 12th place from the apostles hold the inheritance of the episcopate." The office is once again tied to the inheritance of the apostolic mission and authority. His argument is that heretics lack this inheritance and therefore cannot claim to be holding the true faith handed on from the apostles. Quote, "In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth have come down to us." For St. Irenaeus, apostolic succession is the vehicle by which the apostolic doctrine remains present in the church. If the apostolic faith is transmitted through identifiable episcopal succession, and if Rome uniquely embodies the clearest and most authoritative succession, then Rome does not merely preserve apostolic memory, it exercises apostolic continuity. Also, remember St. Clement? Earlier, we examined 1 Clement as an incredibly early witness to how the church functioned in the earliest days, and Irenaeus pays special attention to St. Clement for the same reason. He says St. Clement had seen the apostles and still had their preaching echoing in his ears, and then notes that during St. Clement's time, Rome sent a, quote, "most powerful letter to Corinth." Apostolic succession is explicitly tied to apostolic authority with the ultimate aim of unity. In short, from St. Irenaeus, we see that Peter's role in Rome is treated as an office with a single line of succession, and with each successor said to, quote, "hold the inheritance," which means this is about as explicit of a yes as you can ask for regarding our 4th litmus test. Finally, we come to Tertullian. Once again, in his book, The Prescription Against Heretics, written about 200 AD, this time we will be examining chapter 32. Quote, "But if there be any heresies which are bold enough to plant themselves in the midst of the apostolic age, that they may thereby seem to have been handed down by the apostles, because they existed in the time of the apostles, we can say, let them produce the original records of their churches. Let them unfold the roll of their bishops, running down in due succession from the beginning, in such a manner that the first bishop of theirs shall be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some one of the apostles or of apostolic men. A man, moreover, who continued steadfast with the apostles. For this is the matter in which the apostolic churches transmit their registers, as the church of Smyrna, which records that Polycarp was placed therein by John, as also the Church of Rome, which makes Clement to have been ordained in like manner by Peter. In exactly the same way, the other churches likewise exhibit their several worthies, whom, as having been appointed to their episcopal places by apostles, they regard as transmitters of the apostolic seed. Let the heretics contrive something of the same kind, for after their blasphemy, what is there that is unlawful for them to attempt? But should they even effect the contrivance, they will not advance a step. For their very doctrine, after comparison with that of the apostles, will declare by its own diversity and contrariety that it had for its author neither an apostle nor an apostolic man. Because as the apostles would never have taught things which were self-contradictory, so the apostolic men would not have inculcated teaching different from the apostles, unless they who received their instruction from the apostles went and preached in a contrary manner. To this test, therefore, will they be submitted for proof by those churches, who, although they derive not their founder from the apostles or apostolic men, as being of a much later date, for they are in fact being founded daily, yet, since they agree in the same faith, they are accounted as not less apostolic because they are akin in doctrine. Then let all the heresies, when challenged to these two tests by our apostolic church, offer their proof of how they deem themselves to be apostolic. But in truth, they neither are so, nor are they able to prove themselves to be what they are not. Nor are they admitted to peaceful relations and communion by such churches as are in no way connected to the apostles, inasmuch as they are in no sense themselves apostolic because of their diversity as to the mysteries of the faith. Tertullian is arguing in much the same way as St. Irenaeus that if the heretics wish to claim to hold the true apostolic faith, the method by which they would go about sufficiently proving it is to, quote, unfold the roll of their bishops, running down in due succession from the beginning in such a manner that that first bishop of theirs shall also be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some one of the apostles or of apostolic men, a man, moreover, who continued steadfast with the apostles. Tertullian is not speaking vaguely about tradition, he is demanding a historical chain of office holders. For Tertullian, apostolic Christianity is not merely believed, it is historically traceable. If a communion cannot publicly demonstrate who ordained its leaders and from whom its doctrine descends, then its claims to apostolic authority collapses before it even begins. Also, once again, Rome is singled out as having its apostolic origin in Peter, with Clement explicitly named as a successor to Peter. This passage and Tertullian's argument at large is eerily similar to St. Irenaeus' argument, although the emphasis is slightly different due to both writing to different audiences in different parts of the world. The core congruency in their beliefs regarding apostolic succession proves that St. Irenaeus' argument and understanding was not a one-off situation. Rome's apostolic legitimacy was publicly understood in terms of a bishop succeeding from Peter. In many, especially Protestant communities, apostolic succession is redefined to mean fidelity to the apostles' doctrine or teaching, not necessarily a direct historical line. But to Tertullian, the historic institutional line and the doctrinal consistency line are never at odds, and an incongruency of one disproves the other. According to Tertullian, if you claim doctrinal consistency with the early church but have no historical ties, your claims cannot be taken seriously. And if you claim historical ties, yet your doctrine deviates from the rest of the apostolic doctrine, then likewise you cannot validly claim legitimacy. Quote, for after their blasphemy, what is there that is not unlawful for them to attempt? But should they even effect the contrivance, they will not advance a step. For their very doctrine, after comparison with that of the apostles, will declare by its own diversity and contrariety that it had for its author neither an apostle nor an apostolic man. Because as the apostles would never have taught things which were self-contradictory, so the apostolic men would not have inculcated teachings different from the apostles, unless they who received their instruction from the apostles went and preached in a contrary manner. Tertullian ends this chapter by saying, quote, then let all the heresies, when challenged to these two tests by our apostolic church, offer their proof of how they deem themselves to be apostolic. But in truth, they neither are so, nor are they able to prove themselves to be what they are not. Nor are they admitted to peaceful relations and communion by such churches as are in any way connected with apostles, inasmuch as they are in no sense themselves apostolic because of their diversity as to the mysteries of the faith. Tertullian leaves no provisions for peaceful coexistence with false doctrine or heretical communions. If these heretical groups fail the two tests, then they are not apostolic churches, and therefore are not admitted to communion with the apostolic church. This shows that the matter of valid apostolic succession was treated with the utmost importance for the sake of unity. So returning to our fourth litmus test, the question of succession. Is Rome's Petrine rule portrayed as an enduring office carried forward through succession? According to St. Cyprian, yes. According to St. Irenaeus, yes. According to Tertullian, yes.